In Chapter 4, we're going to take a look at cell membrane transport. So this first lecture, we're just going to look at an overview of the different types of transport. So first, let's just start off by stating the function of the cell membrane. So remember, the cell membrane acts as a barrier. So remember that it's going to separate the intracellular fluid, the cytoplasm, from the extracellular fluid. So it's just a barrier there. And the second question, why is cell membrane transport important? Why do we have a whole chapter on this? So it's really important because the cell needs to be able to get things into the cell, for example, oxygen and nutrients. And then it also needs to be able to transport things out of the cell. So things like waste products, things like carbon dioxide, other waste products. So it needs to be able to get those out of the cell. So remember that cell membranes are selectively permeable. So the phospholipid bilayer, remember, allows some substances to diffuse across but not others. So the first question, which types of molecules diffuse through the cell membrane easily by simple diffusion? So remember that the phospholipid bilayer in the middle there, where the fatty acid tails are, remember that middle area is hydrophobic. So things that are hydrophobic can diffuse right through the membrane. So those are going to be nonpolar molecules. So nonpolar hydrophobic molecules. And that would be, for example, oxygen, carbon dioxide, maybe fatty acids, other lipids. Okay, they can just diffuse right through the membrane. So they don't need a transport protein at all to get across the cell membrane. And then the other type of molecule that can diffuse across the cell membrane are small polar molecules. And a good example there would be water. Because as those phospholipids are moving around, they create little gaps between them, and water is small enough that it can slip through the gaps. So water can diffuse through the cell membrane. It's kind of slow diffusing across, and it is faster to move across the cell membrane if you do use a transport protein for water, but water can diffuse across the cell membrane. Okay, and then which type of molecules cannot diffuse through the cell membrane and need the help of a transport protein to cross? So things that are hydrophilic, they're going to get stopped by that hydrophobic middle of the cell membrane. So if you have ions, okay, a good example there would be like sodium ions or chloride ions. They can't diffuse through the membrane, so they're going to need the help of a transport protein to get across. And then the other one that's hydrophilic that can't get across without a transport protein would be larger polar molecules. And the examples there would be glucose and amino acids would be another one. Okay, so things that are hydrophilic, like these ions and larger polar molecules, they're going to need the help of a transport protein to get across the membrane. So I definitely would memorize what can diffuse through the membrane and what cannot and needs the help of a transport protein to cross. Okay, that's really important, and that's going to keep coming back. So make sure you memorize that. Right, and then this is just a nice picture view of the selective permeability of the cell membrane. So just showing you these hydrophobic molecules, like we've got some oxygen and carbon dioxide. These are nonpolar molecules. They can just diffuse right through the membrane. And then you've got these small polar molecules like water. They can just slip through the little gaps in the phospholipids as they're moving around. And then here you've got some larger polar molecules like amino acids, glucose. They cannot diffuse through the membrane. If you want them to cross the membrane, they're going to need the help of a transport protein. And then another example that can't diffuse through the membrane, also hydrophilic, are these ions. So they also need the help of a transport protein to cross the membrane. So that's a nice summary. Okay, comparing the intracellular fluid versus the extracellular fluid, we do notice there's some differences, and we've talked about this before. So you do not need to memorize any of this. Definitely don't memorize these numbers. So notice that the sodium is much higher outside the cell than it is inside the cell. And then potassium is just the opposite. Potassium is much higher inside the cell than outside. Okay, and then we're going to be talking about calcium later on, especially when we talk about muscles. So calcium is much higher outside the cell than inside. And chloride ions are really easy to remember because if you remember sodium and chloride ions, they match each other. Whatever sodium's doing, chloride ions are always doing the same thing. And then there's always a lot more proteins inside the cell because remember, proteins do a lot of important jobs. They are enzymes, they make up the cytoskeleton, so there's going to be a lot more proteins inside the cell than out in the extracellular fluid. So the reason we have differences between the amounts of these things, noticing that a lot of these are ions or they're larger polar molecules like these proteins, they cannot diffuse through the membrane, and so the cell can control what crosses the membrane by using transport proteins. And so we end up with different concentrations inside versus outside the cell. Okay, and then this is just another picture just showing you that potassium is going to be much higher inside the cell than outside. And then sodium is the opposite. It's higher outside the cell than inside. And chloride ions do whatever sodium does. And so chloride ions will be higher outside the cell than inside. All right, so we have two basic types of cell membrane transport. We've got passive and active transport. So with passive transport, we're going to be moving molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So we're going to be moving down the electrochemical gradient, and we're going to explain what an electrochemical gradient is here in another lecture. And if we're going downhill, remember that energy is not required, and that's why it's passive. Okay, so no energy required, and we're moving from high to low concentration, and we're going down the gradient. And then with active transport, we're going to be moving the opposite direction. So we're going to be moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So we're going to be going up the electrochemical gradient. And if you're going uphill, you got to put energy in. So active transport does require energy. All right, and then this is just a really nice summary of membrane transport, and we can kind of draw a line in the middle here. Everything on the left side is passive transport. So simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, diffusion through channels, and osmosis. And remember, osmosis is diffusion of water. So all of this is passive. You're moving from high to low concentration, going down the gradient, no energy needed. Another thing to remember, anytime you see the word diffusion, put diffusion and passive together in your brain. Diffusion does not require energy. Okay, so it's always going to be passive. And then everything that's on the right-hand side, everything over here is active and is going to require energy. Okay, so we've got primary and secondary active transport. And then vesicular transport, remember a vesicle is a little membrane-bound sac, and that's talking about endocytosis and exocytosis. All right, and then just one other way to look at membrane transport is you can classify whether a transport protein is used or not. So if there's no transport protein used, then that's simple diffusion. So here's a picture of simple diffusion. So just the molecules move from high concentration to low concentration just right through the membrane. And so that's always going to be passive, no energy needed. And then if you're using a transport protein, we've got a couple of different transport proteins that can be used. So there might be a carrier protein, which remember that's going to change shape as it flips back and forth across the membrane. And then we've got a channel protein, which has a hole or a channel through it. And then not pictured in this picture, we've also got a pump. Okay, and the carrier and channel proteins, those are going to be passive transport, and then the pumps are going to be active transport. So it just depends, which one you're using, if it's going to be passive or active.